Hey everybody, my name is Deja and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm recommending y'all some good beginner horror. It is spooky season. I know I haven't posted really that much. Like, since I moved into school, I think I've only posted one video so far. Honestly, this semester has just been really busy for me with it being my senior year, but I'm hoping to get back to posting, especially because it is my favorite season, spooky season. I decorated a little bit. Y'all can't really see all the decorations. I decorated my whole apartment because I'm in a studio apartment this year, so the apartment is really decked out for Halloween and I absolutely love it. I'm wearing also like this skeleton ribcage sweater. I literally almost said jumper, which I don't know where that's coming from because I'm not British, but it's a sweater or jumper, whatever you want to call it, and I'm really excited for this video. I think it was either last year or earlier this year where I asked on Instagram for like specific niche book recommendations and someone asked for beginner horror, so I thought I would save this video concept till this time of year and actually make a whole video dedicated to it. I have 10 book recommendations today that I feel like are really good for beginners if you're new to horror. I feel like I went with like a lot of YA, so it's not as like gory or extreme, and I also went with some like shorter horror because I feel like that's also really good. I also went with some fun, more lighthearted horror because I feel like that might also be a good place to start. I'm also using a different camera lens today, so I hope that y'all like it. I'm still messing with everything, and now I feel like I have to mess with the audio because I have to set my camera back further, but I hope you guys like the quality because I feel like it has improved for sure. But let's jump straight into the recommendations. So first off, I am going to start off with my YA horror. The first recommendation that I have is The Honeys by Ryan LaSala. In this one, we follow our main character Mars, and Mars is actually gender fluid. They are also a twin, and they went to the summer camp with their twin for quite a few years, but Mars felt very disconnected and like they didn't fit in there, but their twin sister continued to go. So she would go, and she was also part of this group called The Honeys, which is kind of like this clique of girls at this summer camp that are, I would say, like popular, but they're just like a little group of girls. And Mars's twin actually ends up passing away very suddenly and actually right in front of them, so that was really traumatizing for them. And Mars decides to go back to this summer camp. It's actually like a summer academy, and he just wants to go there to, you know, see and connect with his twin and like something that she loved to do. While Mars is there, he begins to get closer to this group of girls called the Honeys. This one is super fun. It's a little bit more like fever dreamy at the end, so if that's not something that you would think you would enjoy, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this one. But I feel like this one is definitely like a slower horror, but it has a really good end payoff that I really enjoyed, and I think a lot of other readers would enjoy. I think this one is a little bit heavier because it has to deal with grief, but because it is YA, I feel like it does it in a way that's very palatable for most people, which makes it good for beginners. If you're looking for something that has to do with grief, I think this is also one that you could enjoy. Next up, I have The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. The reason I'm recommending this one specifically for beginners is because I feel like we all know the story of Carrie, and that is a very classic story. I feel like everybody knows what happens at the prom with the blood, and if you don't, I would be really, really shocked. And this one is actually a retelling of the story Carrie, so I feel like Carrie is like a fine book to read in general, but I think I gave it like 3 or 3.5 stars. It wasn't my favorite, versus this one I gave 5 stars, and I just love Tiffany D. Jackson's work. I recommend all of her work, but not all of her work is horror, but I think that she is an amazing writer. I actually have a whole guide to her on my channel if that's something that you're interested in checking out. But this one follows our main character, and she is a biracial girl who lives in a southern town. She's actually being raised by her white father, and nobody in the town actually knows that she is half black because her mother kind of disappeared right after she was born, and she is white passing. Her dad literally makes her stay home when it's raining in case her hair like begins to get curly and people suspect something, which, you know, anybody of any race can have curly hair, but maybe she does have more of like a kinkier texture that makes it more obvious that she is not necessarily fully white. So she has been white passing this entire time, has been straightening her hair this whole time. One day while she's running on the track in gym class, it unexpectedly starts to rain, and her hair does puff up and get curlier, and everybody then knows that she is part black. Some of the people in this school begin to like pick on her and post things online online about her and her race and just like bullying her. And obviously there's like a lot of backlash from the internet about what's happening to this girl. So the school decides to host their first integrated prom. This does still actually happen in modern day where there is segregated proms. This one does take place a few years ago, but it does still happen in the South, because what will happen is the school will not host a official prom and all the white people will host their own prom, and then all the black people are just kind of like left out to dry. So the school decides to host an official prom that's going to be integrated, so it'll get like better publicity for them in the town. This follows the Carrie plotline after that. If you know, you know. And I really love this story. I think that Tiffany D. Jackson took such a classic story that we all know and wove in very important topics that Stephen King would never ever touch, and I just thought it was so well done. Her writing is so amazing, and I actually did a live show for this when it first came out a couple years ago. I just realized when I did that live show that every single word that she put on the page and every stylistic choice she made was with a purpose, and nothing was done just because. She did it all with purpose and meaning, and I just really love that. I feel like, again, this one is a retelling of a classic, so I feel like if you've seen the movie or you just know the story, that you would still enjoy this one, but it kind of has a little bit of extra in it, and I feel like it's really good for beginners. Next up, I have House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. This one I would recommend, especially if you enjoy fantasy. This one is actually marked on Goodreads as fantasy verse, but I consider it a horror verse. This one follows 17-year-old Iris, and when her and her two sisters who are older than her were children, something happened to them and they like mysteriously disappeared and came back. They didn't remember what happened to them, but they had scars like on their body, like these little like crescent moon scars. All of their hair is white and they're like very skinny, tall, kind of lanky, and that's not necessarily part of their genetics. So obviously something did happen to them, but they have no idea what it was. At the beginning of this book, one of Iris's older sisters actually disappears, and so Iris and her other sister are retracing the last steps of their sister to try and figure out what happened to her. And the weird things start to happen to them, like a corpse falling out of their sister's ceiling and just really weird things, and they begin to realize that their sister was actually holding back some secrets from them. I really enjoyed this one, and again, I think if you like fantasy, this could be a really good transition because I feel like it has an even amount of horror with fantasy elements, and you kind of even go into a fantastical world a little bit in the story. So I think that could be really fun and engaging for someone who is more of like a fantasy reader. And the last YA horror that I have on this list is The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. I feel like this one is good for all readers, but if you do like historical fiction, this is a historical story that takes place in Puritan society in like the New England colonies. We follow Emmanuel, and she is actually like an outcast in the society. She's very looked down upon because her mother actually had Emmanuel with an outcast, someone who was not part of their community, and that is very frowned upon. Her mother also would go into this forbidden forest that's near the community that Emmanuel lives in, and Emmanuel's mother has actually passed away, so Emmanuel is being raised by some family members. And Emmanuel begins to be drawn to the dark forest surrounding her community and ends up actually going into it. And there are spirits that lurk within this forest that end up giving her a gift, and that is the diary of her dead mother. And she realizes through this journal that she has more in common with her mother, and that her mother actually sought sanctuary in these woods as well. Emmanuel begins to kind of question her society and where she belongs. I really love this one. Again, I feel like if you like fantasy, this one is also marked versus fantasy on Goodreads, but I consider it more of a horror. But if you like fantasy, if you like kind of like historical time periods, I think that this one could be a really fun one. But also if you don't really like those things, then I think you could also still really like this one. Those things are not necessarily things that I traditionally love. Like, I'm not a huge fantasy reader, I'm not a huge historical fiction reader, but this is one of my favorite books of all time. So I would really recommend just trying it out, see if you like it, because I think it has a very important discussions. This does have more fantastical horror elements in it, but I feel like the true horror of the story more has to do with the puritanical society, and I feel like that is a little bit less scary for some people, which is why I'm recommending it for beginners. Next up, I'm moving on to shorter horror, and I do have a short story collection, and this is by an author I would not traditionally recommend for beginners, but I feel like this short story collection is still pretty palatable for beginners, and that is The Trees Grew Because I Bled There by Eric LaRocca. Eric LaRocca, I would say, is very intense. I would not necessarily recommend him traditionally for beginners, beginners because I feel like his stories can be pretty graphic and grotesque. But this short story collection is very bite-sized. There's 8 stories in it, and they have to do with like love, grief, obsession, and I feel like they didn't go into too much gory graphic detail, so I feel like it could still be really, really good for beginners. And if you're just looking for kind of like a collection to try out a couple different stories to see what kind of horror that you like, I think this is a really, really good one. It is a great collection. I will still say though that if you can get past this, you can definitely get into traditional horror, because some of the stories, while they are short, and I think that's what makes them so palatable, they are still definitely horror. So I feel like if you like these, then you should definitely try out other types of horror. Next up, I have The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval. This one, again, I think I'm recommending because it is so short. I don't think the horror is too extreme, and this is actually kind of a retelling or takes inspiration from H.P. Lovecraft. And this one also is like historical. I can't really remember the time period. I want to say it's like 1800s, and we follow this man who is kind of like almost like a dealer, or like he is basically sells like magical items, and he ends up selling an occult tome to a sorceress who actually lives in Queens, New York. This takes place in New York City. This is definitely like a unique type of horror, but I feel like it's not super like scary or anything like that, and again, it is kind of like fantastical and historical a bit, so I feel like that kind of makes the horror of it a little bit more palatable. Next up, I have Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. This one is super short. It comes in at 136 pages, and this one's actually about a teen prank where basically I believe one of this group of teenagers works at a movie theater, and the other teens who they're friends with decide to take a mannequin and put it in the movie theater, so like they might tell them to like get up at the end of the movie, and then the mannequin obviously won't get up because they are a mannequin, but the mannequin does actually end up leaving the theater. I think this one is a little bit spookier, but it is definitely really fun and kind of has a little bit of mystery in it, and I think this one again is so short, so it makes it kind of a little bit more palatable. It's a little spooky, but it cuts off at just the right point that I don't think it would scare you too bad, which makes it pretty good for a beginner horror reader. Next up, we're moving on to like my more fun horror, and the first one's actually like a whole author, and that is Rachel Harrison. Specifically, I'm recommending Cackle, but I think Rachel Harrison's work in general is really good for this because she's actually classified as like cozy horror, because her horror can be a little bit more fun, a little bit more camp, and it's not like super scary necessarily. I think the more scary elements of the story are like these subtle things that these women go through in her story. She definitely focuses on women and women's issues, and it kind of puts it in a more horrific lens, and she does kind of paint it from a more horror lens, but the horror is actually more of like a metaphor for what's going on in their life. So it may be like misogyny or family trauma or different things that women face, and it is definitely more subtle, and then the horror of the story is usually like a metaphor, so it's not like normally super scary. Like she has a werewolf book. The one that I'm recommending, Cackle, is more of like a witch book, but it's not like super scary or anything like that. I think that her work is definitely like perfect for beginners. I'm actually doing a Rachel Harrison reading vlog right now where I read the rest of her work that I have not read, and I think I only have 2 books left, so I'm excited to finish those off. That reading vlog should be coming soon, and I'm really having a good time reading all of her work. Her work also tends to be pretty funny, and like the inner monologue of the characters is really hilarious, so I feel like that kind of lightens the mood a little bit as well. So in a Cackle specifically, we follow our main character Annie, and she's kind of played her life very safe. She was in a long-term relationship with a man, and he ends up dumping her, so she applies for a teaching position away from where she lives in Manhattan and moves to a small little quaint village in, I think, upstate New York. And she loves the town. It's so like picturesque, and the like people who live there are just so nice and kind to her, and she's really like loving that she made this change for herself, because she never really got to do anything for herself like this before, and she feels like it was really the right move for her. Then she meets this woman named Sophie, who's extremely beautiful and charming and just magnetic, and Annie is very drawn to her, and Sophie actually takes a bit of an interest in Annie as well. But the villagers in this town are kind of warning Annie to stay away from Sophie, and they seem a little bit scared of Sophie. So Annie's kind of like wondering what's up with her, but she's also very drawn to her and can't really stay away. I think this one is so fun, and it really explores like the issues that women are going through, but in a kind of like fun way, but still mixing horror in there as well. Next up, I did want to recommend for beginners who want to get into horror something that is a traditional slasher. Slashers tend to be a little bit more gory, a little bit more graphic. So I don't know if they're necessarily the best for beginners, but I knew when I first started reading horror, I just kind of like jumped straight in. So if you're looking to just kind of jump straight in instead of like testing the waters, you just want to do a big old cannonball into horror, I feel like this one would be a good place to start, and that is Camp Slaughter by Sergio Gomez. It is not by any means the most graphic slasher that I ever read, so that's why I'm recommending it, but it is a really fun one. It's definitely really reminiscent of like Friday the 13th. If you have watched those movies before and you like those, I feel like this one would be a good next transition. Or if you like really any of like the classic horror movies and like those villains like Scream or Halloween or Friday the 13th, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, any of those, I feel like if you watch those movies, you could definitely read this book. This one follows a group of teenagers that go rent out a cabin in the middle of the woods, and in these woods there's a place called Camp Slaughter. Nobody really knows if it's true or not, or if it's kind of just like a myth, and these college kids soon learn that it is not a myth and there is definitely truth behind it, because there is a cannibal living out in these woods that is beginning to hunt them. It is so fun. Like, I think that if you just want a fun campy slasher that's very reminiscent of classic horror movies, this is going to be a great one. And lastly, I have My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. I think Grady Hendrix, again, he writes very kind of campy, fun horror. Some of it is really graphic though. Like the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is my favorite book by him. And there's specifically a rat and a roach scene that are very like gross to me, that I'm like, ugh, like I can't recommend that for beginners just from those two scenes alone. But in general, his books are very like campy and just like fun horror, so I feel like they also are pretty good for beginners. And this one I feel like doesn't really have too many like gross, grotesque scenes like the Southern Book Club's Guide, so that's why I'm recommending it. So My Best Friend's Exorcism follows two girls who have known each other since 5th grade, and they're absolute best friends. But once they get to high school, one of them starts to act a little strange, and coincidences and things start to pile up. So her best friend realizes that something is definitely wrong with her and begins to theorize that there is a demon inside of her. So she is going on this quest to try and basically exorcise her best friend and get this demon out of her. This one also takes place in the 80s. So if you like 80s kind of campiness or Stranger Things, I feel like this one would be a good kind of next step if you want to kind of transfer that to a book. So those are my recommendations. I try to give a variety of recommendations for people who are at different places in their horror journey, or if you like these types of stories, you may like that in a book. I really hope you guys like this video, and if you are a beginner to horror, I hope that you got a recommendation that you can walk away with and hopefully get a little bit into the horror genre for this spooky season. If you made it to the end, leave the little skull emoji down below since I'm wearing like this skeleton sweater, and I will see y'all in my next one. Bye everybody! I'm running rhymes in the kitchen, soaking the moments we live in. Yeah, you got the nerve to be on me, taking your life out of you. If you got my number, don't add me, 'cause baby